Hi there, I'm Stephanie Call. I'm an associate professor in the history department, and my job now is to introduce our next speaker. Do I have it up here? Okay, so Adriana Chira started out in archaeology and anthropology at Cambridge, but luckily for us, took the right turn and headed to history. And she went to the University of Michigan, where she received her PhD in history in 2016. She then promptly landed a job at Emory University, where we were just discussing. My daughter is considering enrolling next year. And she left a year later for a postdoc at Yale in agrarian studies. And she's published in Law and History Review and has an advance contract for her manuscript, Becoming Free of Color, Afro-descendant Cubans and Racial Identity, 1791 to 1868, from Cambridge University Press. She teaches courses on Cuba and the Caribbean and Atlantic world history, but also one on human trafficking, which I've decided is maybe a theme based upon the last three papers here, and the last two and coming forward. And I'd love to see that syllabus too. There are a bevy of awards and fellowships, dozens of conference presentations around the world. There's tons in her CV to indicate that she's a much sought-after scholar. And though enumerating accolades is often a feature of introductions, I always think it's more interesting to just take the last few minutes and interest you in acquainting you with why Chira has received these accolades. That is, of course, because she's developed fresh, new ideas, insights into the lives of the enslaved and recently emancipated Cubans, how they shaped their own freedom and their own nation. By tracking down ordinary men, women, and families of varying degrees of African ancestry in legal records, church records, property records, and many more, she's understood how they embraced a silence that would come to structure later Cuban nationalism. That's a silence of their color-based identities. Her clever title, which maybe you thought was a typo, Becoming Free of Color, not Becoming Free Color, but Becoming Free of Color, hints at how important racial identity, or perhaps the lack thereof, was in the enterprise of creating a Cuban nation. So without further ado, let's hear her speak. Please join me in welcoming Adriana Chira.
Thank you all for being here at this time. I know it's the time when we are sort of becoming more quiet, sleepy, and so on. So, and I also want to echo the other presenters. Thank you for the investment you've made in us, for bringing us here, herding us cats, because I'm sure it was not that easy to get us all on the same page, given all the responsibilities that we have at our own schools. And also thank you for investing in emerging scholars. It's very rare to have young scholars without a published book come and give this sort of lecture. So I'm very grateful for that kind of statement that you're making. So I'm going to start with a burning plantation. It's an image that us Caribbeanists really like using. The year is 1869, and we are in Cuba's far east. The mountains surrounding the city of Santiago de Cuba. A group of around 110 men set fire to several coffee and sugar plantations, and their action, it was a guerrilla action, right, was part of a larger military struggle for Cuba's independence against Spain. The War of Independence had started a year earlier in the neighboring province of Manzanillo, which is also on the eastern side of the island. You can see it right there on this map. This is a map of the provinces. It's a 19th century map of the provinces, and Manzanillo would be right here, the province of Manzanillo. The province of Santiago de Cuba is right here. It's in yellow. So the War of Independence had started in Manzanillo in 1868. And the leadership within Manzanillo was a very peculiar one compared to the guerrilla soldiers, insurgents in Santiago. In Manzanillo, the leadership consisted for the most part of wealthy landowners and urban professionals. Many of them had been educated in places like Spain. They were lawyers. Their actions, their military actions, had focused primarily against the very institutions of the colonial presence, against the government, local government, for instance. By contrast, however, in Santiago, the insurgency consisted of fugitives from slavery, land tenants, land squatters, people whose economic opportunities had been squeezed out as sugar and coffee had started expanding within the area since the 1850s. Moreover, unlike the Manzanillo insurgents who focused on the institutions of colonial government, the Santiago rebels made a much stronger statement through the choices of their target, the plantation, right? They were not afraid to attack the heart and symbol of the Cuban economy at the time, showing, therefore, that Spanish colonialism was fundamentally intertwined with the institution of the plantation. This was a very dangerous gesture, as some of you might know. Burning down plantations very often came with death sentencing, right? So, for the people who are engaging in these acts, they took that particular risk. Most prominent amongst the insurgents in Santiago was a man by the name of Antonio Maceo. Between 1869 and 1890, Maceo would become one of the leading symbols of the Cuban War of Independence. He would become the general of the army, one of the two generals of the army. And Maceo, unlike his Manzanillo counterparts, would push the leadership of the other members of the independence, or the other members of the leadership of the independence war, to expand their desiderata beyond independence to include general emancipation and equality for all, regardless of color. So within insurgency's ranks, Maceo's skills, he was an incredible soldier and planner, military planner. So his skills and charisma quickly propelled him from the status of a foot soldier, which is how he started, to that of a general. Moreover, his martial feats and reputation traveled very far across the two Americas, into the beginning of the 20th century even. Let me go back, actually, yes. So at the turn of the 20th century, several prominent Afro-descendant intellectuals would place him in the large canon of great black revolutionaries alongside Zumbi, Toussaint Louverture, and Frederick Douglass. In the US, for instance, some African-American activists situated their struggles against Jim Crow South laws on a par with Maceo's own military efforts against the Spanish. We find the references to the War of Independence in New Orleans newspapers, for instance, and as well as in newspapers from other major port cities across the United States. I have an excerpt here from the from a newspaper published by the Louisiana-based Committee of Citizens, which organized the Palmer Plessis Supreme Court challenge to racial segregation. The newspaper that they published was called the Daily Crusader. They were following very closely Maceo's actions within Cuba, clearly identifying themselves with his struggle. Suggesting a sort of Afro-diasporic identity formation, right? Moreover, you also see an excerpt from an article by Arthur Schomburg, whose library collection, right, forms the foundation of, or is one of the major collections within the New York Public Library, right? And he was also very interested in Maceo's figure. This article is from the 1930s. Like the Afro-descendant members of the Committee of Citizens in New Orleans, Maceo believed that the differences based in color did not matter. But one of the features, one of the ways in which his political beliefs were appropriated by Afro-descendant liberal thinkers, intellectual liberal thinkers of the time, but also oftentimes by other historians, is that it was to associate his notions of anti-slavery and racial equality with liberalism, with political liberalism. And I use the term liberalism here in the sense of 19th century liberalism, not as we use the term necessarily now. And within the 19th century political thought, liberalism rested on the belief in universal freedom and in equality before the law. So liberal political ideology of the time, it emerged as a set of policies, right, in the early 19th century, even though the roots of it go all the way back to the 17th century. But the 19th century liberal political forms assumed that society consisted of autonomous individuals, right, who were self-possessed and in control of their own will, which in turn enabled them to control property, to own property. By this token, political community was secondary to property ownership, right? Political community emerged contractually in order to protect private property interests. Property ownership and the liberal vision of what property is fundamentally shaped debates about the rights of people of color in the two Americas across the 19th century. Most major abolitionist movements were premised on the assumption that private property and freedom were two related universal rights. They could not be separated from each other. One was born free, and one was born with a capacity to own property, including property in one's own self, right? Hence, freedom. But I argue in this paper that if we dig deeper into the worlds that Antonio Maceo was actually coming from, the political ideologies that animated him and the first anti-slavery insurgents on the island did not emerge out of these liberal agendas. Rather, they emerged from a much more localized and customary notions of justice that were highly hierarchical, yet premised on an emphasis on collectivity, on collectivism. And I use the term collectivism here very cautiously. This is not a romantic vision of collectivity. Rather, it is one that's nevertheless hierarchical and has some openings that free people of color and many enslaved people used in order to advance themselves. One other term that I want to qualify is the idea of customary justice. What is a justice system based on custom? By justice, I mean notions of what is right and what is wrong. And by customary, I mean that local communities themselves were engaged in determining the boundaries of what is right and what is wrong through debate, negotiation, contention. And we see it's very hard to track these kind of debates amongst people who did not necessarily produce their own papers, their own pamphlets, their own manifestos. However, we do see traces of such debates within first instance district courts. So the courts the courts where you have the first encounter between enslaved people and free people of color with the institutions of the state, right? And I have to explain something here for those of you who are not students of Latin American history. Within the Spanish Empire, enslaved people did have the right to bring suits through special legal counsel against their owners in certain circumstances, most notably if they were harmed. And the meaning of harm, what was particularly remarkable about 19th century Cuba, that in a place such as Santiago, the meaning of harm was expanded quite broadly by enslaved litigants, and it was a very creative and interesting process to watch, and I'm going to explain this in a second. Let me go back to custom, though, because I think this is an important concept that I'm going to talk about some more here. Historians traditionally considered custom to belong to a world predating modernity, a world of fixed hierarchies that favored people at the top, the local elite that controlled, right, local institutions, property, and so on. A world in which social status was established at birth by heredity. One's genealogy mattered. One's labor mattered less than one's genealogy within this particular world, according to this account. Within such a not yet modern world, individuals were supposed to not be equal before the law, right? Judges applied, and we see this also in the Spanish context, right? Judges applied laws based on one's status within the pre-established hierarchy. By this token, then, the world of custom and slavery belonged to the same epoch, this not so yet modern world, And therefore, one might ask, how could we see then a movement against slavery emerging out of customary notions of justice, right? It's a very legitimate question. However, I'm going to show through case studies how this worked in practice. And it's a very practical, this is one of the things that I want to emphasize about my work. It's very empirical, very empiricist in some ways, work because it emphasizes the sort of nit and grit that goes into the making of notions of what is right and what is wrong. And it's the nit and grit of very small people, very ordinary people. Many of them are actually women. And people who are relatively disempowered, right, vis-a-vis the institutions of the state. And figuring out what they think and what their political consciousness is very hard. What we have to do is look at what they did in order to get to those political ideologies that they held. It's a relatively, I find it a very difficult archival research work, right, kind of work. And one of the things that I'm showing is that there was far more fluidity than we assume in these worlds of custom, right? And in how status was imagined and allocated. And moreover, it was this fluidity that informed the anti-slavery mobilization that Maceo would lead in the 1860s. Moreover, what I want to argue is that unearthing this world of custom is not unearthing a very eccentric space, a very unimportant space, a very marginal space. There are other similar spaces to it across the Americas. I'm working on doing this comparative work, looking at spaces inhabited by free Black peasants that occupy an intermediate landscape between the plantation and the commons and communal land holdings and the urban areas to understand if there are resonances, similarities in how custom works and anti-slavery ideologies emerge in the long term. Okay. So I want to go back to idea of private property. We will delve into Santiago in a second. I want to go to the urban center 19th century abolitionist movements, right? Because they are usually the ones that form they are the model, the archetype for how we conceive of abolitionism. We tend to think that what makes the 19th century distinct, one of the features that make it distinct, is the enormity of the struggle that rich and poor, Black and white, young and old, men and women were ready to put up to make the notions of freedom, private property, equality before the law come true in reality, right? Become a reality across the Atlantic world. However, we do know that the meanings that these different groups associated with freedom or with property varied very widely and contextually. Some prominent political figures emphasize the economic nature of this proposition, right? So for instance, and this is something that Professor Castillo mentioned earlier, there were slaveholders in places such as Brazil or Cuba who used liberalism, right? An ideology that we associate with freedom, equality, and so on. They actually used liberalism and its emphasis on private property ownership as the source of all rights to justify the ownership of enslaved people as part of the sanctity of their private ownership, right? But other prominent figures emphasize the political nature, right, of private property. There were liberal political theorists who endorsed the universality of private ownership and that argued that people had the right to own their own selves by that token, right? Hence, hence freedom was also a universal feature of humanity. There was something profoundly liberatory about this ideology, especially for the middle classes, for people, the middling sectors of society, because the liberal model questioned the arbitrariness and unmeritocratic nature of hereditary-based societies, hierarchies. For us, the notion of private property seems natural. It's like water, right? It's like a meteorological phenomenon. We've grown up with that, with it, it's all over us. We live in a highly gridded world. However, at the turn of the 19th century, and I cannot stress this strongly enough, the notion of private property and the notions of freedom rooted in it were relatively strange, and because relatively new from a legal standpoint, from a political standpoint. So, for instance, in the Spanish Empire, social order was supposed to reflect the God-given order, right? And it was hierarchy that defined the social order. Hierarchy was supposed to be a good thing, and it was pre-established. It was given by the divinity. The whole purpose of the political system was then to maintain this hierarchy, to bring back a world of potential disorder back to the hierarchy that would give it order. All individuals and families were given privileges rather than rights, and the notion of privilege is that you receive such privileges from the representative of God on earth, right, the monarchy, with the intent of participating in the process of maintaining order. Such privileges could therefore be suspended if you were a cause of if you're causing trouble, if you were causing disorder. These are from legal doctrinal perspective. In a more liberal environment, right, by the 19th century, the notion that emerges is that individuals are born with rights by nature. They have rights by nature, and that political governments cannot suspend those rights. Those rights simply exist, and the purpose of government is to reflect those rights, to create a system of governance that would reflect those natural, would allow those natural rights to manifest themselves, and therefore the Commonwealth, the society would thrive as a result. So when this notion of natural rights and property right as a natural right emerged, and that it emerges also within the Spanish Empire. There are Iberian-based thinkers who endorse it and advocate for it through legal treatises, for instance, and other kinds of writings. It upsets this older vision of a God-given order, and moreover, it inserts the idea that labor, or in other words, merit, rather than heredity, was the source of one's political rights. The historians of emancipation have looked at this language of private property and of contract that it came with as a very transformative one, and one of the engines for abolitionist movements, and perhaps one of the reasons why the middling sectors of society were so drawn to these mobilizations. So one of the questions that 19th century abolitionists asked in the British Empire, if private property was supposed to be sacrosanct, why shouldn't the enslaved people also partake in this right and have rights to their own slaves? Most notably, for instance, there are many historians, but one who's written extensively on this is David Bryan Davis, who pointed out that these new ideologies touting social relations as akin to contracts and touting private ownership as the best way to organize property relations was the reason why middling sectors of society were drawn to abolition across the Atlantic world. So rather than feeling threatened by the abolition of slavery, the middle class is actually used anti-slavery to undermine the power of an established hereditary elite and to make a market-based wage labor, to make market-based relations, wage labor, appear natural, right? But the problem with this theory of abolition is that it places a lot of emphasis on the middle class white elites, on urban centers and their allies. It focuses also on an urban free population of color that did relatively well compared to the black peasants who I am going to look at here. And it focuses on the urban primarily. Some scholars have brought into the conversation groups that have traditionally been on the margins: women, enslaved families, free people of color. They have also inserted a more global approach. However, the focus has still remained fundamentally urban. When rural areas are folded into the narrative, they come in through, with reference to enslaved people's insurgencies. So Santiago doesn't fit exactly quite well in this narrative because unlike West Central areas of Cuba, Santiago did not witness any large-scale slave insurgencies throughout the 19th century until the beginning of the War of Independence. Moreover, there were forms of manumission in Santiago that did not draw on this intellectual liberal rhetoric. And these forms of manumission from below, I argue, are at the root of this later mobilization in 1868. However, these forms of manumission from below, as I described them, are also they are not articulated as part of a larger anti-slavery ideology. We see them as action. So we have to derive, if we are to understand their politics, it's still the people who are themselves involved in the process did not write political manifestos to explain themselves, right? Their politics were not self-consciously defined as politics. Okay, so let me turn to Santiago now. At the turn of the 19th century, Eastern Cuba was a relatively forgotten area in the Spanish Empire, and throughout most of its colonial history, Santiago remained a backwater. It was the second largest city on the island, indeed, and the seat of the Departamento Oriental, or region also known as Oriente, a status that it acquired in 1607. However, even notwithstanding this status, it remained relatively underfunded, undercapitalized. Countless official visitors and royal administrators described it as, quote, poor and miserable, a village, aldea, a terra incognita, unknown territory, home to an apathetic and unintelligent population. This is primitivist languages, and I'm sure you can understand it's also a very racializing language. These sort of tropes were meant to suggest that given the inability of the local population, for the most part Afro-descendants, to start sugar planting, which is what was considered to be the only economic path forward for a Caribbean region, this region needed outside saviors to come in and rescue it from its provincialism. Some faint, I have also an image from Cantero, right, which some of our other presenters had images from this album collection of representations of plantations. This was considered to be the proper way of developing an economy, right? The sugar plantation, the industrialized sugar plantation of West Central Cuba. By contrast, Eastern Cuba was supposed to be an unknown terra incognita. Alexander von Humboldt traveled to Cuba on two separate occasions that were relatively close in time at the turn of the 19th century, and he argued that the geographic scope of the island basically ended in Trinidad, which is exactly it's halfway through, right? So he assumed that whatever was beyond these sugar-making areas simply did not exist. And most of his information he had collected through his conversations with sugar planters, right? That was his main, those were his main interlocutors. Until the end of the 19th century, the province of Santiago consisted mostly of unparceled and heavily forested mountains, and these forests were sometimes dotted by squatting cultivators who would set up small tobacco farms along rivers on lands that were owned by the crown. So most of about 57% of the royal lands on the island were situated in the Santiago and Guantanamo provinces in the far east. This was also, as you can imagine, an ideal hiding ground for contrabandists, which is what some people did. They engaged in contraband. They would take tobacco or cattle to Haiti and Jamaica. But this was very small-scale contraband. It didn't result in large financial benefits. It was other aspects of the ecology that shape that would shape the politics, and this is one of the arguments that I'm making in my work, that there are material that the experience of slavery is material not just in the sense that the political economy and global political economic processes affect the very lived experiences of enslaved people and of free people of color in these spaces, but also the actual material nature of space, right? Open up or close off certain opportunities. So in the case of Santiago, it's a very humid environment because of the forest, and the rivers tend to overflood during the rainy seasons, cutting off the main pathways connecting rural hamlets to the city. So many runaway slaves formed long-standing communities outside of the city and relied on these closures of infrastructure to protect themselves, right, from militias trying to find them. And indeed, in the elite imagination in Havana, these indefatigable and indomitable runaway communities, known as maroon communities, right, came to symbolize the area's backwardness, primitiveness, and blackness. Just a little bit of historical background for those of you who are not familiar with Cuban history, to explain why did this happen, why did Santiago's developmental path take another course. It started at the end of the 16th century when Havana was designated as the main stopping point for the silver-filled galleons traveling from the Americas to the Iberian Peninsula. And as a result, Havana consistently received more investment in its military and had a very vibrant shipping industry and local economy. In the 1740s, the West became a testing ground for a small sugar industry, which would really start booming after 1763, so at the end of the 7 Years' War, and even more importantly, after the Haitian Revolution, when Saint-Domingue, Haiti, reduced its production of sugar and coffee, and much of and then the planters in Western Cuba decided to fill in the niche opened up in the global markets for these commodities. In Santiago, there was one lucrative economic activity, which was copper mining, beyond tobacco, which had ups and downs. But copper mining supplied copper for the sugar cauldrons in Jamaica primarily, until about the late 18th century. It was brought to a halt after a protracted decline, and what brought it to a halt was not just mismanagement, but also maroonage strikes, actual labor strikes by the enslaved people who worked on these mines, and who formed maroon communities in the mountains and refused to go back into the mines until in 1800 they received en masse freedom from the crown. The site of El Cobre is a sacred site now in Cuba. It is marked by a shrine to the Virgin of El Cobre. There was an apparition by Virgin Mary at the end of in the 17th century. She appeared to three enslaved men, to two enslaved men and one indigenous man. Juan Diego is the most known figure and the one who filed a petition to have this apparition recognized. Since then, the Virgin of El Cobre has become the saint of the patron virgin of Cuba, of the island. But something happened in 1803. So with the conclusion towards the end of the events that would come to be known retrospectively as the Haitian Revolution, a wave of refugees from Saint-Domingue came to Santiago, and this would make Santiago into an idiosyncratic place. It's not a space of fugitive space, so to speak. It's not just marked by maroon communities. It's also a space in which there are some plantations that emerge. And I think that there's this interesting tension between the maroon spaces and the plantation, that in between that would be that would be the home for the communities from which Maceo would emerge. So in 1803, 20,000 refugees from revolutionary Saint-Domingue relocated to Santiago. Some of them were relatively wealthy and savvy coffee cultivators. Saint-Domingue had been famous not only for its sugar production, it was also the largest coffee producer. These refugees, for the most part, decide to cultivate coffee locally. That they see that that's the ones who are wealthy. They see that that is the economic niche that they could actually occupy given the landscape. In 1809, during the Napoleonic invasions of the Iberian Peninsula, and many of them go to New Orleans, right nearby. But some of them return in 1817, and they restart these coffee plantations. The land was cheap, and moreover, the global prices for coffee were extremely high after 1814. The future seemed very bright at first for them, and they import an unprecedented number of captives through, at first legally, but then gradually through, as the trade is outlawed, through contraband networks. They bring in, but because they do not have the same amount of financial resources as sugar planters in the West, they bring in mostly women and children. It was also the case that a very large percentage of the captives on these contraband slavers were, in fact, women and children. So the arrival of these particular kinds of these demographic groups in Santiago is shaped both by what was available in West Africa and by the resources that the coffee planters themselves had available. But even though they have, they do relatively well economically, these coffee planters, they retain relatively tenuous control over the populations of enslaved people under in their power. And that is because of the rugged territory, right? And the presence and example of these maroon communities that draw in, they attract, they provide an example, right, for those held on plantations. So one of the solutions that the planters come up with to control people, they realize that coercion alone is not, or physical coercion alone is not sufficient. So they try to use emotional coercion, and they encourage the formation of family ties. So they create relatively, because of the arrival of so many women and children, they create, the population on these plantations is relatively gender balanced, unlike the sugar plantations in the West. And moreover, they encourage godparentage ties. So in Catholic societies, as some of you might know, godparentage is a very important, it's part of spiritual, it's a form of spiritual parenthood, and it's a hierarchical relation. The godparent has the obligation of not only educating the godchild into the Catholic doctrine, but also very often provides support, emotional support, financial support for the duration of one's lifetime sometimes. The godparents, as we will see here, would also do that. They provide, in some cases, they would provide legal support to bring up lawsuits, but they also provide knowledge about the background, about the sort of landscape of the plantation, about the relationship between these plantations and the city, and so on. And indeed, the godparents who were baptizing, I'm drawing this information from hundreds of baptismal records from these plantations. And what we see in these records is that there was the hierarchy of the plantation is reflected in the hierarchy of godparentage ties. So the godparent tended to have a relatively higher status relative to the godchild, in the sense that they might be enslaved people born on the plantations, they might be Creole, right? They were born in Cuba rather than being born in Africa, or they might be domestic slaves rather than plantation slaves, which gave you access to certain resources. And this would matter. And sometimes there were free people of color from the area, right? But these kinship networks that were supposed to buttress, right, the planters' power as a form of, as part of their emotionally coercive methods, by the 1830s and 1840s actually start opening up avenues to freedom. So what happens? By the 1840s, coffee production starts declining. It starts declining already in the late 1820s and 1830s. Cuba simply cannot compete with Brazil in terms of labor costs. It cannot also compete with Brazil in the North American markets, which were the main market for Cuban coffee, because of tariffs that the US government introduces on retaliatory tariffs that the US government introduces on some Spanish imports. And that means that the Cuban planters lose markets. Moreover, there are several hurricanes that destroy the actual infrastructure on plantations. And it's at this moment where we see people buying themselves out of slavery or simply gaining access to freedom suits with the help of free people of color or godparents, right, who are either related to them directly biologically or as godparents are pulling them out. Yet, enslaved people's reliance on free Afro-descendants comes with a new customary form of inequality and of dependency, and it also comes with a new color-based taxonomy, a new color-based socio-racial hierarchy. I'm going to introduce you to a legal case that I worked with to give you to illustrate these new forms of dependency. And then I'm going to introduce you to one other case that illustrates the emergence of the socio-racial taxonomy. So the case of Antonio Miro, it's 1849. Antonio Miro is a free man of color, and he comes before the first instance district court in Santiago to contest a testament. The testament had been filed by a woman by the name of Basilia Echevarria. She had been Miro's godmother. Basilia Echevarria had recently passed away. According to a very vexed and upset Miro, and his testimony is very long and very evocative and very dramatic, in her lifetime, Echevarria had borrowed from him 280 pesos, leaving no testamentary provisions to pay him back. At the time, 280 pesos was not a negligible amount. It was roughly the equivalent of an unskilled laborer's wages for more than 2 years. So it had been very hard work for this man to actually accumulate this money. But as the case developed, it became clear that the ties connecting the plaintiff with the deceased had been very complex. Echevarria had been a free woman of color and had been not only Miro's godmother, but she had also actually been his owner. In her lifetime, Echevarria had set up a very curious but very successful operation designed to bring out of slavery as many people as possible, while also expanding her network of dependents. As a godmother to enslaved people, she provided her godchildren with the price of freedom, expecting them to reciprocate by handing their wages over to her over a period of 1 to 2 years. With the money that she received, Echevarria then provided credits to other individuals she invested them in other kinds of operations that would have given her even more capital to spread around, to give it to other people. She sometimes bought properties for her freed godchildren. Indeed, Miro had received an apartment from her. This would, from some perspectives, this could look like a good deal for Miro. However, it seems that in spite of the seeming charitable scheme, some of the godchildren were discontent, and there were others who would come and to contest the testament. But I'm going only to focus on this one for the purposes of brevity. But the judge would have none of Miro's complaints. In fact, he went so far as to scold him for being ungrateful to a woman endowed with a profound social conscience, whose struggles to free slaves were well known and well respected in the community. Indeed, Miro himself might have waited until Echevarria's passing to claim his money, which suggests that he probably was afraid of her, right? So he didn't take her to court before she died. She contested the testament later on. what I want to point out here is the operative notion of property here is not the liberal kind of property. It's one that we see spread out across different people. Miro owns some part of himself, but Echevarria also does. The boundaries between what Miro owns of his time and what Echevarria owns of his time were also very blurry. They were negotiated in practice. Most of the lawsuit consisted in the judge trying to figure out what kinds of rights this man actually had, given his very ambivalent, ambiguous status. The community itself watched and arbitrated. There were all these gossips and people who turned out had been watching closely and had been taking notes, right, mental notes, who come in to testify, right? And so what we see is not a sort of a title-based notion of property. It's one in which the community decides who does and owns what. In the end, Miro loses the case, right? He, just to give you the sort of the end, he loses his case, and the other plaintiff's wives, only one woman manages to actually wrangle something from the courts, but it's not actually a full restitution or anything like that. There were other kinds of customary privileges that enslaved people negotiated, and that the courts acknowledged, in spite of the fact that. So one of the things that comes up in the case of Miro is that the judge at one point throws his arms in the air. He looks at the statutes, he looks at the case, and he decides that it's impossible for him to actually align the letter of the law with what had been done in practice, and that the only way to decide on the case in a way that would be right would be to decide based on equity. The principle of equity means that justice would be done in such a way as to not to cause a disturbance of the peace, right? So Miro would get something, not everything that he wanted. Some of the other plaintiffs got something, not everything that they wanted. However, it was sufficient enough that they would not question the institutions of the state. They would not go cause acts of violence, let's say, or start an insurgency, right? So the principle of equity, or the operative in the courts at the time, was designed to maintain the peace. Right, and that was an opening for enslaved people or for people who had this in-between status to go and claim some rights. It wasn't a principle that completely blocked them from accessing the courts. Some other cases, and you can read this in the article that I published, if you're interested, or talk to me later on, other kinds of rights, like locally negotiated rights that completely misaligned with the letter of the law that people negotiated through these courts of first instance, and that became customary. For instance, are the right to be treated as if you were free, even though you had no manumission papers and you had not paid in full the price of your freedom. However, the entire community was aware that you were an as if free person. What this meant was that on the one hand, somebody got some more autonomy these people got more autonomy for themselves, but at the same time, the problem with this particular category is that it can only give you autonomy in an area where there isn't where the slave market is not really working well, right? For the planters, right? Where people can stay put, because in other contexts it wouldn't quite work. People would be removed and taken to other regions where labor was in demand. So let me take you to a case study that shows again how these customary notions of justice are also paralleled by customary notions of status, and in this case of socio-racial status that again the local institutions embrace. And this is brief. I'm almost done, I promise you. I know that it's been a long day for all of us. This is a notarial act. It's a notarial act. It's a testament that was filed with a notary, and there are hundreds of them. And I'm going to give you one that's illustrative. It was filed by a woman by the name of Maria de Belen Fernandez in the mid-1840s. In the final version of this testament, there was no reference to her color. She was the legitimate daughter of a member of the local colored militia and his wife, Juana Maria Trujillo. She was married in 1846 when she filed this act. She was married, had raised 12 children, and she owned 3 enslaved people. The notary did not place Fernandez in the white category, which was usually marked with the respectful term of address, doña, in her case, or don in the case of men. But he did not associate her with appellatives denoting blackness, morena libre, parda libre, de Africa, de Guinea, which were widely used to describe people whom the community regarded as being of African descent. We could assume that perhaps she had an exceptional status because her father had been a member of the local militia of color. She had been, her birth had been legitimate. Her parents had been married inside the church, which was relatively rare amongst people of color, and relatively rare in the Caribbean for marriages to be officiated inside the church. Moreover, she owned property and slaves, right? So we might assume that that gave her an extra leg up. However, it looks, if we look closely, there were many other people like her people who were of known African descent. In this case, we know that her father had been in the militia of color, right? That marks her African descent to some extent, right? And we know that there are hundreds of other people locally in the 1840s who are not associated with any color-based appellatives, but they are of known African ancestry. We know this by crossing these large bodies of serial data, parish records, census data, testaments. They might appear at birth as being marked by color. However, throughout time, by the end of their lives, when they start filing testaments, or halfway through their lives when they start filing testaments, those appellatives disappear, or in later censuses. What is particularly interesting about these people is that some of them do own slaves, and they're definitely more likely to own slaves than people who are marked by color in these notarial records. However, one distinguishing aspect of their lives is that they have large clientelar networks. So when we look at the sort of their living quarters, about which we can again find out through notarial records, through their testaments, and through census records, they have their households include large numbers of so-called agregados, who are people who receive lodging in return for some services. Many of these agregados are marked by color. Many of them are morenos. And many of them seem to have experienced slavery in their lifetime. I don't have a very large sample to be able to prove that I have a large sample, but I haven't been able to go into the stories of every single individual. But it seems to be the case that the agregados are much closer to the institution of slavery than these individuals whose association with color terms had faded. It was precisely these kind of individuals whose association with blackness, so individuals of known African ancestry, whose association with blackness had faded, who would be at the forefront of the War of Independence. And Antonio Maceo was indeed one of them. The Spanish bureaucracy who was documenting the beginning of the War of Independence was very confused about whether or not he was black or white, in fact. He's marked as white in some documentation, he's marked as a don in some documentation, and it's only later on that they figure out that he is coming from a family of locally known African ancestry. So what would have turned this particular group against the institution of slavery? How do they emerge as this anti-slavery group, given that they have vested economic interest, right, in owning slaves, as I pointed out as Fernandez, for instance, did, or Basile Echevarria did? So one thing some of the answer is political economic, right? That there's an expansion of sugar interests in Santiago, and the ability to buy slaves and thus acquire dependents is restricted for these small property holders, right? They don't have the capital that these expanding coffee plantations and sugar plantations have. The price of enslaved labor goes up. Moreover, the plantations themselves are putting pressures on the land. So the tobacco cultivators had historically been, most of them had been squatters, and they moved around, they moved their location, they were very nomadic population, and they were being pushed further and further in the interior, further and further away from the port city, which made it harder for them to ship their leaves. It drove up the cost of production for them. There was definitely a circulation of news about the U.S. and the Civil War that would have also affected their politics. And moreover, there were changes in the law in the sense that judges were left with less discretionary power to decide based on equity and on custom, which closed down the door for these local-based notions of rights and of recognition that had been available earlier on. So the screw is turning. However, one of the things that is particularly interesting about these sort of clientelar networks, and I want to emphasize one more thing before I close. It's sort of I think it's important to the whole story, is that the likelihood of Afro-descendant of owners of slaves who are of African descent to manumit their slaves were much more likely. So this is something that I did by computing number, looking at testaments, comparing the sort of processes of the number of enslaved people whom white owners manumitted versus owners such as Fernandez would manumit throughout their lives. And it seems to be the case that Afro-descendant owners would manumit and then provide lodgings for these former slaves. These former slaves would become their dependents. Right? And one of the features of Maceo's first insurgent lines was that they were organized around clientelar networks. So these old kinship-based, godparentage-based, economic-based dependencies that had enabled some people to emerge out of slavery become the political tools through which the leadership of the insurgency locally is bringing people together against the Spanish Empire. And one thing that I want to argue, so that the process is relatively collectivist at the local level, it's highly hierarchical. Some people born in Africa are treated as being far further down, right? Further down on the hierarchy compared to people such as the Maceos, who had emerged economically and had these large networks of dependence. But what I want to argue is that these clientelar networks would also shape processes of mobilization locally well into the 20th century. So this region, even though it becomes the sort of magnet for sugar interests from the U.S., for these expanding plantations, the localism persists, and it's a localism that the people of color in this area protected, and it would shape processes of insurgency for land rights in the 1930s, for political rights amongst populations of color in 1912. And moreover, I mean, there isn't, this is a very messy genealogy, and it's not a direct continuity. However, these forms of collectivism were at the heart of the squatter mobilization around the 59 revolution as well. So I do want to emphasize that this clientelism that has long, deep roots in processes of emancipation did shape statecraft locally for the long, long haul. Thank you.